Ch.24, Dallying HuaLian, Nightfall in Sinner's Pit. The more the mud-face tried to entice them, the more HuaLian became alarmed. Everyone stand back, don't go near him, and don't listen to a single word he says. The crowd broke up and hurriedly moved away. The mud-face continued to chuckle. There's no need to be so mean. I'm a human too, I won't hurt you. Oh, you're mistaken, you look nothing like a human. HuaLian thought. Just then, one of the merchants suddenly snuck back towards the field, perhaps thinking he must still bring back some herbs for the wounded. He bent down to pick up the bushel of ferns he had dropped in. Fright earlier, but the mud-face twisted and spotted him, a glint in its spinning eyes. Oh no, HuaLian thought, rushing towards the man. Don't pick that up. Come back. But it was too late. The mud-face opened its mouth, and a long, blood-red thing slithered out. What a long tongue. HuaLian grabbed the merchant by his collar and hustled backward with him in tow, but the tongue that flew out was freakish in its length, and barged right into the merchant's ear. HuaLian felt the body in his hold convulse violently. The merchant's limbs reeled non-stop, and the man let out a short agonizing scream before falling to the ground. That long tongue dug out a large chunk of something bloody from his ear, and brought it back to the mud-face's mouth. The mud-face happily chewed and cackled, his laugh so disturbingly loud it filled the entire palace grounds. H-A-H-A-H-A-H-A-H-A-H-A-H-A-H-A-H-A. Exclamation mark. So good, so good, so delicious, so delicious, so delicious. Exclamation mark. I was so hungry, so hungry. His voice was sharp and shrill, both eyeballs bulging and bloodshot, horrid and obnoxious. This man, who had been buried for over 50 years in the grounds of an evil-filled kingdom, had already been molded into its soil and became something other than human. HuaLian loosened his hold on the deceased merchant, his entire arm shaking. He was about to attack the repulsive monster when the mud-face screamed again. General! General! They're here! They're here! A deafening cry, more savage than that of a beast, echoed in the distance. A dark shadow dropped from the sky and landed heavily in front of HuaLian. The entire palace grounds quaked in its landing. When it slowly stood up, the crowd was jailed in its enormous shadow. This man was gigantic. His face was as grim as steel, his expression ferocious and turbulent, like the face of a beast. A thin layer of armor draped from his shoulders and reached down at least 9 feet. Rather than a man, one could say he was more like a walking wolf. Behind him, more and more similar forms appeared. 1, 2, 3, over 10 of these men jumped off the roofs of the palace and surrounded them. Each one of these men were large like horses, built like beasts, and carried a sharp tooth-filled mace on their shoulders. They might as well have been werewolves. When they encircled around the intruders in the garden, it was as if a large steel cage had fallen upon them. They were the soldiers of Banyu. These soldiers emanated a black aura, undoubtedly no longer alive. HuaLian was tense, with Ruoye in position ready to attack. However, when those Banyu soldiers saw them, they didn't rush in to kill. Instead, they raised their heads and roared in crazed laughter, and howled in a foreign language. The sound of their words were ghastly, guttural and heavy in tongue rolling. It was the language of Banyu. Although it had been 200 years and HuaLian had pretty much forgotten the language, he did review it with San Lang earlier in the general's tomb, and the words uttered by those soldiers were loud, simple and vulgar, so they weren't difficult to understand. He heard the soldiers call the first man general, their conversations filled with words such as take them away and won't kill for now. HuaLian took a deep breath to force himself to relax. He said in a low voice, "Everyone, don't panic. These Banyu soldiers won't kill us for now. It seems they want to take us somewhere else. Don't do anything rash. I can't guarantee I'll be able to fight them. We'll figure this out as we go." It was clear that those soldiers would be hard to fight, each of them thicker than the next, even with Roy in hand. Suffocating one would probably take a lot out of him, never mind 10. With mortals with him, HuaLian couldn't do anything bold, and could only remain vigilant and protect them the best he could. San Lang didn't say anything, and the others had already lost all nerve, even if they wanted to do anything rash. They wouldn't know how, and could only nod tearfully. Next to them, the mud-faced screamed again, "General! General! Please let me out. I detained your enemies. Let me go home. I want to go home." Seeing the Banyu soldiers, the mud-face became hysterical, screaming and crying, blabbering nonsense, with some Banyu words mixed in, no doubt learned from the many years he spent buried here. The massive 9 feet man they called General seemed to have found the squirming mud-face deeply disgusting, and swung his mace towards him, smashing his face into a bloody mess, the teeth of his mace piercing his brains. When he pulled up his mace again, the entire body was pulled out with it, fulfilling his wish of "let me out." However, the body that was unearthed was not a full human body, but rather a chilling skeleton. The merchant screamed in fright. The mud face, bloody after having crumpled off the mace, seemed to have also frozen in fear after seeing his own body. "What's this? What's this?" "It's your body," HuaLian reminded him, seeing that the mud face was numb in disbelief. This man had been buried in the desert for over 50 to 60 years. His body fertilized the Shanyu ferns until they had cleaned him of his flesh, with only bones remaining. "How can this be?" the mud face cried. "My body isn't like this. This is not my body!" Exclamation mark! Exclamation mark! His voice quavered as he cried out, but HuaLian only thought him tragic and terrifying. He shook his head and turned away. Next to him, San Lang laughed mockingly. "Is it only now you're not used to your body? What was that thing that came out of your mouth earlier? You didn't think that odd?" The mud face countered immediately. "That wasn't odd. It was just a tongue a bit longer than average." "Yeah. Sure. Just that much longer, maybe." "Ha ha." San Lang's voice was full of ridicule. "That's right," the mud face cried. "It's only just that much longer. It's all because I spent decades trying to live off of insects, forcing my tongue to extend. That must be how it came to be like this." Perhaps he was indeed still human when he was first buried, and did his best to survive by swallowing insects with his tongue, but he became less human over time. His tongue grew longer, eating more than just insects, worse things. Having been buried for so long, however, he couldn't see his own true form, and could neither accept nor believe that he was no longer human. The mud-face kept trying to assure an unlistening audience, there are other people who have long tongues, not just me. Stan Lang laughed again. Watching him, HuaLian could feel chills hearing him laugh. HuaLian thought that sometimes when this boy smiles, there's a certain cruelty hidden beneath the skin, a coldness that could rip off flesh. Do you think you're still human? Stan Lang asked. Hearing the question, the mud-face became agitated. Of course I'm human. I'm human. The mud-face screamed and tried to move his white bony limbs all at once, as if trying to crawl away. Finally unearthed, he was mad with joy, cackling, I'm going home. I'm going home. Ha 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 ha. Crack. The Banyu general seemed to finally have had enough of this monster's shrill cries, and crushed his bones in one stomp, killing any more of his I'm human. After trampling the mud-face, that general roared to the others. Then, the Banyu soldiers all raised their maces and growled to HuaLian's group, and started herding them out of the palace. HuaLian walked up front, with Stan Lang still following close behind. Despite being ushered by ruthless Banyu soldiers, the boy's step was still light and casual, as if taking a stroll. HuaLian had been meaning to find opportunities to talk to him, and after a while, when the Banyu soldiers went back to conversing amongst themselves, HuaLian spoke in a low voice. Those Banyu soldiers called their leader General. I wonder who it is. As expected, Stan Lang had answers to all of his questions. When the kingdom of Banyu fell, there was only one general. His name, translated to Hanzi 28, is Chemo. Chemo. HuaLian wondered at the odd name. That's right, Stan Lang said. Apparently, it was because he was awfully weak when he was young, and was often bullied. He rallied and built his strength training with large stone mortar plates, and got his name thus. HuaLian rubbed his forehead and thought, so, he's a Hulk. Stan Lang continued, legends have it that Chemo was the strongest warrior in the history of Banyu, 9 feet tall and extremely powerful. He was a loyal supporter of the Guoxi, even after death. Is he taking us to the Banyu Guoxi now then? HuaLian asked. Perhaps, Stan Lang replied. If there were more Banyu soldiers there, how could they escape? Who knows how Nan Feng, who had lured the other two away, was doing? The Shanyu Fern was now in their hands, but how were they going to deliver the ferns to the wounded within 24 hours? All they could do now was go with the flow, and adapt to any situation that arose. HuaLian walked and mulled, and noticed that General Chemo had been leading them to a remote place at the far end of the fortress. When they stopped and HuaLian looked up, a colossal wall stood before him like a giant. The destination was the Sinner's Pit. Although HuaLian had lived in the Banyu area for a time, he rarely entered town, and had never gotten near the Sinner's Pit. Seeing it this close, HuaLian's heart started pounding. The mud-yellow walls had a set of stairs along the outside, and while climbing up to the top, HuaLian scrutinized the pit and tried to look over the depths until he finally understood why his heart was pounding. It wasn't that this was a place of torture and cruelty, and it wasn't his worry over everyone getting pushed in. It was feeling the palpitations of a very powerful array at work. There was a strong array drawn around the entire sinner's pit, and this array only had one purpose: to prevent the fallen from ever surfacing. That meant that even if a rope or a ladder was set down into the pit, whoever tried to climb up from the bottom would get cut off halfway through and get thrown right back into the bottom. HuaLian impassively used the wall as support to climb up the stairs, but was really feeling up the make of the wall. He found that although it looked like the wall was built with mud or concrete, it was actually a much stronger stone, and probably enforced with a layer of magic. When they reached the end of the stairs and came to the top of the pit, standing along the wall's eaves, the only word to describe the sight was awe. The entire sinner's pit was formed by 4 encircling great walls. Each wall was about 30 feet in length, 20 feet in height, and 4 feet in thickness. At the very top of each wall there was nothing, neither gazebos nor railings. Within the enclosure was a deep abyss without a bottom in sight, and with the growing night, there was only blackness and a chilling smell of blood wafting in the air coming from below. No one dared looking down whilst walking along the railingless eaves that were tens of feet above the ground. After a while they could see the pole that stood in the center, and atop the pole hung a corpse. It was the same one they had spotted earlier. The corpse was of a small, black-clad girl, tattered and head bowed. HuaLian had known that this pole was used especially for hanging criminals that deserved shame and humiliation. Usually, the prison guards would strip the criminals of their clothing and hang the body naked. The criminals would die from starvation or dehydration, and after death the corpse would be left to flail in the wind, burn under the sun, and rot in the rain. When the corpse had rotten completely through, it would fall into the pit itself, an exceedingly ugly sight. The corpse of that girl didn't seem to be rotten, so it must have not been long since she died. Perhaps it was a local girl that the soldiers captured. To do such a vulgar thing to a young girl, HuaLian felt thoroughly disgusted. Zhao Tiansheng and the others' faces turned white seeing the sight, and paused in their steps, afraid to go forward. Mo didn't bother pushing them onwards, but turned toward the pit and howled. Why is he howling? HuaLian wondered in his mind, but his question was soon answered. From the bottom of the dark pit came a chorus of growls in response to the howling. It was like the roars of beasts, bellows of tsunamis, wails of monsters, hundreds and thousands of cries exploding in the air. The walls trembled with the noise, making those standing on the eaves lose balance. HuaLian could clearly hear the sound of rocks and debris falling within. Only criminals were thrown into the sinner's pit. Were those the souls of the dead answering Mo? Mo howled again, and HuaLian paid more attention, listening. This time, Mo wasn't making meaningless noise, and it wasn't curses either. Instead, it was encouragement. HuaLian was very sure he heard the words, "My brothers." After howling, Mo turned to the soldiers watching HuaLian and the others, and roared another command. HuaLian understood. He had said, "Just throw in 2 and detain the rest." The others might not have understood what was being said, but the intent of those soldiers was not hard to guess. Everyone looked pale as ghosts. Lian saw that a couple couldn't even stand upright anymore, shaking from fear. He stepped forward and said in a small voice, "Don't worry. If anything happens, I will go forward first." Lian thought if they must all fall, then he might as well be the first one to check things out. It couldn't be worse than venomous snakes and beasts or menacing ghosts. He couldn't die from falling, he couldn't die from poison, he couldn't die from bites, and he couldn't die from getting hit. As long as it wasn't some pool of corpse-dissolving water, his body shouldn't be damaged too horribly. Besides, he had HuaLian with him. Even if he might not be able to escape from the array, he could still use it to catch the others that'd fall after him. Mo had said, "Detain the rest," meaning that most others should be temporarily safe. After all, it wasn't easy hunting for prey in the Gobi Desert. They should rather savor them instead of eating everyone in one go. Lian cleared his thoughts, but next to him, someone else couldn't hold their breath any longer. Ever since they reached the top of the thinnest pit, besides San Lang, who looked like nothing was out of the ordinary, everyone else was shivering in fear, especially Zhao. He must have thought that if he was to die, he'd go down fighting. He closed his fists and charged towards Mo. This charge looked as if Zhao was ready to bring Mo down into the pit with him. Mo was the bigger man, strong like a steel tower, but even he got pushed back 3 steps from Zhao's desperation. He roared in anger, and instantly threw the young man into the dark void. Everyone started screaming, and Lian called after him too. Zhao. Just then, from deep within the chasm came a roaring cheer, and sounds of violent ripping of flesh, like starving beasts fighting for their only meal. It was easy to understand from hearing the noises that the young man Zhao would never survive. Lian did not expect this development and was dumbstruck as well. He had been suspicious that Zhao was a subordinate of the Banyu Guoshi, purposely leading travelers astray to the ruins. He was also suspicious that the one who was here 50 to 60 years ago was him, but the young man ended up being the first to get killed. With this jump, how could he still live? Was he faking his own death? But now that they were all enslaved under the control of the Banyu soldiers, if Zhao was the Guoshi's subordinate, he'd have the upper hand and could very well reveal his true identity in glory without doing anything extra like this. Why would Zhao rush towards Mo and die a meaningless death? Lian's thoughts were in knots again, and the Banyu soldiers began searching for the next victim. Mo sized him up and pointed at Tian Sheng. Another soldier then moved up and opened his palm, ready to push. Terrified, Tian Sheng fell to the ground on his knees and cried, "Ah! Help! Don't take me! I'm..." Without any more time to think, Lian stepped forward and said using Banyunese, "Hold on, General." Mo was shocked to hear the words from Lian's mouth and waved his hand, stopping the soldiers. "You know how to speak our tongue. Where are you from?" "I'm from the Midlands," Lian replied. He wouldn't have minded lying to say he was also a citizen of Banyu, but with how rusty his fluency was, there was no way he could keep up the lie if he conversed too much. Besides, it was also obvious from his looks that he was a Midlander. Mo's question was only from simple confusion. The people of Banyu Detested liars more than anything. If HuaLian was found out, the results would be worse. Midlands. Hemo questioned. Descendants of Yongan. No, HuaLian replied. The kingdom of Yongan has long since fallen. There's no more Yongan now. But to those of Banyu, all those who came from the Midlands were pretty much the same. They were all relatives of the descendants of Yongan. They were annihilated by the army of Yongan, so the moment he heard where HuaLian was from, Chemo's black face immediately flashed with rage, and many of the Banyu soldiers also started growling, cursing vulgarly at him. It wasn't much more than vile Midlanders. And throw him down, and HuaLian couldn't care less. Chemo demanded of him, our kingdom disappeared in the Gobi for over 200 years. You are not of our people, why do you know our tongue? Who are you? HuaLian couldn't help but steal a glance at the calm boy behind him, mentally hoping that if his lies fall apart later, maybe he could shamelessly ask San Lang to save him. He cleared his throat and was ready to start gathering nonsense when just then, another series of enraged growls sounded from below. It seemed that whatever was down in the pit had finished ripping apart a Zhao, but was still hungry for more, using their cries to convey their thirst for fresh blood. Chemo waved his hand again, ready to have Chan Sheng thrown over, so HuaLian spoke up. General, please take me first. Chemo had never heard anyone request to go first, and his eyes bulged like bells. He asked in disbelief. You go first. Why? HuaLian couldn't tell him the truth and say because he wasn't scared. He thought for a second and came up with a logical answer. General, those are innocent merchants. There's even a child. Chemo sneered. When your army annihilated my kingdom, did you not think we also had innocent merchants and children? The fall of the kingdom of Banyu was over 200 years ago, and since then, countless dynasties had come and gone. But they were the dead whose time had stopped. Hatred and grudges would not fade with the changing of times. Chemo continued, you're very suspicious, I will need to question you. You are not going down. Throw in another one. There was no helping it. HuaLian was ready to jump if all else failed, anyway. Behind him, San Lang stepped forward. HuaLian's heart lurched and he turned around. With his arms crossed, the boy was nonchalantly looking over the dark bottomless pit with an air of intrigue. This wasn't a good sign. HuaLian called out, San Lang. Hearing his call, San Lang looked over and smiled softly. It's fine. San Lang took another step forward and was teetering dangerously on the edge. Both HuaLian's head and heart started pounding. He called again, wait, San Lang, don't move. At such height, at the brink of the pit, the boy's red clothes danced in the night breeze. San Lang glanced at him again with a smile. Don't be scared. You come back here first. Come back here and I won't be scared, HuaLian said. Don't worry, I'm just going to leave for a bit. We'll see each other again soon, San Lang said. Don't. Before he finished, the boy took another step forward, his arms still crossed, then with a light leap he disappeared into the abyss. The moment he jumped, Roy shot out from HuaLian's wrist, a stream of white flash trying to grab hold of the boy's form. Yet the drop was too swift, and Ruoye returned without even a sleeve corner. HuaLian fell to his knees at the edge of the wall and yelled, "San Lang!" Exclamation mark. Exclamation mark. No response. No noise. After the boy jumped, there was not a single noise. Next to him, many of the Banyu soldiers started yelling instead, all dumbfounded and bewildered. What was with today? In the past, they had to catch their prey and throw them into the pit, but tonight their prey took turns fighting to jump down on their own, and when held back, they jumped anyway. General Kimo yelled to get his soldiers under control. As for HuaLian, when he saw that Ruoye didn't catch San Lang, he didn't take the time to think before taking a leap off the wall himself. But when his body was still in midair, he felt his collar tighten, and he stayed in midair. Turned out when General Kimo saw he also jumped, he stretched out his arm and nabbed HuaLian by the collar, preventing his fall. "If you want to join me, that's fine too," HuaLian thought, and like a snake, Ruoye shot out once more and wrapped itself up the arm of Kimo, then roped his body whole. Kimo saw that white silk band was unpredictably deadly and spirited, and contorted his face and popped his veins. His muscles instantly burst in size, trying to rip apart the fabric tying him down. HuaLian was at a standstill with Kimo when he saw something peculiar from the corner of his eye. The corpse that was hung on the pole suddenly jerked, and raised her head slightly. The band of Banyu soldiers also saw the corpse move and started yelling, swinging their maces to attack it. But the black-clad girl somehow untied herself and hopped off the pole, then sped over towards them. She was like a black wind blowing through the eaves, fast and wicked. The soldiers couldn't maintain their balance and soon were swept into the sinner's pit one by one, screaming. Enraged, Kimo screamed all sorts of vulgarities at her, many of which were street slang that HuaLian couldn't understand well, but he did understand the first words. "It's the bitch again." The swearing ceased in the next moment because HuaLian suddenly pulled, and brought Kimo to fall into the pit with him. Into the inescapable sinner's pit. Whilst falling, Kimo roared with such violence, killing HuaLian's eardrums, he had to call Ruoye back and gave Kimo a kick to get the general further away from him to protect his ears. Then he urged Ruoye to fly upwards to try and grab hold of anything that could prevent him from falling further, or to grab hold of something so that when he hit ground it wouldn't be too painful. But the sinner's pit was not built to save. And with such a powerful array at work, there was nothing HuaLian could find to hold. He thought he was going to crater and flatten like a pancake like he had many times before, when suddenly, in the darkness, there was a flash of silver. The next moment, a pair of hands lightly caught him. Whoever it was had caught him perfectly, as if this person was made just to catch him at the bottom. With a hand across his back to grasp his shoulders, another under his knees to support his weight, the dreadful gravity of the fall was dissolved to nothing. Still dazed and confounded from falling from such a height, HuaLian unconsciously held on tight to that person's shoulders. He called San Lang. The pit was filled with darkness, nothing could be seen, including the person holding him. But HuaLian still called that name. The person didn't respond, so HuaLian patted and squeezed his chest and shoulders. Just to make sure. Stan Lang, is that you? Maybe it was because here at the bottom of the pit the stench of blood was heavy and disorienting, but HuaLian dazedly continued to feel up the person holding him until he reached a strong hard Adam's apple. He came to in shock and immediately reprimanded himself, pulling his hands back. What was he doing? Is Stan Lang right? Are you all right? Are you hurt? It took a moment before he heard the boy's low voice from somewhere very close to him. I'm fine. For some reason, HuaLian felt this voice was curiously different than before. 28 Hanzi is the term for Chinese character writing,